Hello, I just wanted to briefly talk about indigeneity and the problem with it with concerning the Gazans and the Palestinians. So indigeneity, according to like the United Nations and a couple other more globally oriented organizations like the World Bank, there's a couple different definitions. So it's a group that occupied uh, a certain period of occupied a certain bit of land in an earlier period. Essentially, like you can think of it as the first people who arrived there. People who view themselves as indigenous, so it's kind of a self-ID, self-identification thing. And they view themselves as distinct as the general population. But the weird thing for me, for how the World Bank defines it, the UN defines it, is it's also an experience of subjugation, marginalization. So why? Why is that a part of their definition of indigeneity? I mean, essentially, like Han Chinese are indigenous to China, but they're not marginalized. So therefore, according to the UN, they're not indigenous. Like it seems like they're just kind of twisting the definition in such a way to feed into this like whatever colonialization narrative of Europeans are not indigenous to Europe because they're the ones in power. It's kind of like how they redefined racism, like the exact same way, where you can't be racist if you're marginalized. Whereas before, racism is just like if you believe there are differences between races. Um, so that's the basic definition of racism. Then there's also connotations, like if you believe there are differences, then there are probably some races who are better than other, and there's some sort of superiority or hierarchy. But that's a whole different thing. But so they're like redefining indigeneity just so that it doesn't include European cultures. It also doesn't include like most Asian cultures either. Um, so pretty much the only ones that are included in it is like essentially Native Americans, indigenous in Australia, and arguably you could talk about indigenous groups in Africa. But like there doesn't seem to be real any rhyme or reason for that, except for that it feeds into like the post-colonial narrative. Now, for a lot of these indigenous groups, there's something called the land back movement. This is also very popular in socialist circles because, of course, everything has to deal with like power and oppressor or oppressed narratives. So, land back is essentially that Native Americans should receive the land that was stolen from them and they should have their own sovereign nations. Same thing with Aboriginals, etc. And it's very particular that they need land. It's not like you could just say that, well, maybe you provide them money or something like that. There's something particular in that they need land in order to regain their identity. Now, this is also actually very similar to the blood and soil idea, Blut und Boden. So blood is race, and that's connected to the territory, the land, with concepts of soil and territory. So in this way, a lot of indigenous groups are kind of feeding into this 19th century. Well, I mean, it's 20th century, but it's got roots into 19th century, like folkish movements, etc. With this idea of, well, if you're indigenous, then that means that there must be racial differences between you and other people that are not indigenous. And there's something to where, like, oh, well, you're indigenous to a particular land, that your blood itself, because again, indigenous implies some sort of genetics because it's You're a part of a group, however that's defined, that uh, originates or was the first to arrive on a particular piece of land. So this was also pretty similar to how there was race nationalism in Germany and elsewhere. So in the end, like, these land back narratives are essentially a resurgence of blood and soil uh, narratives and paradigms. But whereas Europeans can no longer have it because that's racism, Nazism, etc., it seems like there's a weird pass giving to indigenous groups, including the Palestinians. And so this is Jacob T. Levy, a very famous political scientist, and he particularly focuses on how tied land is to indigenous narratives. So when we talk about Palestine and it's Palestine's land for some reason, it is a blood and soil narrative. Now, on the other hand, you could simply argue that there's no such thing as indigeneity, that your ancestors might have arrived to a particular piece of territory first, but that doesn't give you any special claim to it as if somehow you're tied to the land. And it's hard for me to really figure that indigeneity doesn't lead to some sort of racial socialism, something like that, because you're solidifying a group, you're tying them to a territory, so national territory, and you're making it as if you purchase the land from them, or if some other group takes over, which is literally the history of the human race, then that's somehow a mark on their identity. When in all honesty, most people have moved from place to place. So yeah, I don't really hold a lot of value in any sort of indigenous narratives or anything like that. Human history is migration. So I don't actually believe there's any such thing as indigenous or indigenous to the land, whatever. And anything like that is just a blood and soil argument. That includes when the Jews do it. Like, the reason why Jews deserve to have the state of Israel is because they fought for it, and because now they live there. And so you can't just, unless you're gonna pay them, like, get them to leave. So the big problem I find with Palestine and Israel is that I think most Israelis are fine with the idea that Israel is just a social construct, and it's not necessarily that they're indigenous. Obviously, there's religious groups that are going to be arguing for that, and maybe even some nationalist groups. But I think Israel's a pretty liberal society, so most of them are pretty much just living in Israel because they can have a good life there. And that's like their home or whatever. Whereas Palestine and Palestinians, they're pretty intent on the idea that they have to own land, and it has to be their land, and it has to be the land that somehow they feel that their ancestors were born there, even though most Palestinians probably came from Egypt or Saudi Arabia, or the few that have been there, they probably haven't been there for thousands and thousands of years. They've probably been in and out in the whole region, like everyone's family groups have been, with all the different warring factions arriving. So yeah, I don't. This whole leftist acknowledgement of Palestine must be free is kind of just a underhanded or an implied support for blood and soil ideology.